आज का क्विज क्या है? स्लाइडो वाला है? अच्छा। वैसे हाउ मेनी ऑफ यू एंजॉय दिस फन क्विज? किसको किसको मजा आता है? Okay, let's get started. Unnati, over to you.
Harshit, how to join the quiz?
The link is in the chat box. Or
Okay,
simply go to slido.com and type the code 4274585.
okay.
Waiting for few more people to join. कितने लोग हो गए? 27 या 49 है? आधे लोग सो रहे हो क्या? Akash, I think we are good to go.
Okay, so question 1. Which tag is used to save space in HTML and use inline specification?
क्या लगता है
Yeah, be
option?
section, spam, space.
It's section.
Let's see. Most of the people selected spam. Span, sorry.
Pushkar, Piyush, Amita. Great.
Oh, this one's easy. Full form of CSS. You have to get this one right, okay?
यार ये ऑप्शन किसने लगाया था? पुष्कर भाई तू टॉप करेगा आज लग रहा है. Okay, Akash, let's do one thing. We will keep the record of this entire quiz of this entire series. All right. And we will be giving the prizes if someone is consecutively winning for one or two quiz. You were the winner of yesterday's quiz, too, right? नहीं रहा है लग रहा है.
What are the 3 ways to write CSS? Inside Sharda.
Word is here, bhai. Word is here. I what tough options are.
Piyush,
Yes,
congrats.
thanks.
Okay, so let's move forward with the session. Akash, are you here?
Yes.
Please continue.
All right, so I think you all enjoyed this fun quiz. Now it's time to again revise the whatever we have studied yesterday, and let's get started with the CSS part today. So we have our awesome instructor Ayush with us, and we have our awesome team of co-team members. अरे आयुष कौन है? Yeah, Ayush, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Harshit. So let me just share my screen.
वैसे just a random question. How many of you are learning web dev to present your project in this Technovation hackathon? Is there anyone? Ayush, you are bringing your own competitors. No worry.
So I hope my screen is visible. So yesterday we discussed a little bit about CSS. So we'll quickly revise what we discussed yesterday. So I introduced about what CSS was. We talked about like CSS was basically a styling language, right? It was used to decorate our website. The next thing we discussed was that how to like there were three ways that we looked at writing CSS, and I said that what this essentially is saying is where we are writing our CSS, right? Like these three are referring to locations. Where are you writing your CSS? And we looked at inline CSS, internal CSS, and external CSS, right? So if I go back, we saw all this, right? So when I talked about inline CSS, I basically said that whenever you're writing CSS, you're going to be writing within the element itself, right? Within any element of HTML, within this element, within this element. All of this refers to inline CSS. Like if I say style, background color, red, right? So it will make like the whole body like background red, right? Like you can see it became red. So this was the concept of inline CSS, right? The next one we looked at was internal CSS. Internal CSS said that I want my code within the same HTML file, but I want it different from all the elements. Meaning I don't want it congested within here or within this element. I want it separate. However, I want it within the same HTML file. So we declared internal CSS like this, right? And we also saw that the inline CSS has a higher priority than internal CSS and external CSS, right? Where I showed you like if I apply like the same thing, like if I say body background color blue, right? Now if I go back, you can see nothing got changed, because if you notice that I still applied an inline CSS of background color red. So inline CSS will override any internal or external CSS, right? Finally, we looked at creating an external CSS file, right? External CSS file basically said that I want all my CSS code in a separate file, right? I don't want it within that same HTML file because it can be a little, congested and it can be difficult to read the code, right? And we also looked like how do we connect, right? we have created the file, but I don't know how to connect the file, right? So this is the way you have to connect your external CSS file. A question came up yesterday was what was the point of this particular attribute, right? This attribute basically states the relationship between the HTML file and the CSS file, right? Or you can say it basically defines the type of file that we are declaring within here, right? Remember href, what it's doing, it's basically declaring the location of our, our CSS file, right? Like because our CSS file, it's located within this particular directory only. If it is located within the same directory as your HTML file, all you have to do is write the name with the extension, right? And this says that, okay, because it is a style sheet, right? CSS stands for what? Cascading style sheet. So this is declaring that it is a style sheet, and here you will find my location, right? So we looked at, this was some of the things we looked at. We looked at inline, internal, and external CSS, right? Next thing we discussed was CSS syntax, right? So if I go back here, we talked about like how we can, declare any, properties for any element, right? So if you remember, I basically gave an example of how you can remember the syntax. I said that the first thing that you can see is considered the selector, right? So the selector is basically which element do you want to select? Which element do you want to select so that I can apply the style, right? Which element? So you can see which element, right? Do you want to, choose h1 paragraph, whatever element we have declared in the HTML, right? Next one was what? Next one was property name, right? Property name was what? It was basically like, what do you want to apply, right? Like here you can see, what do I want to apply? Like, do I want to increase its font? Do I want to, change its background? Do I want to change its color, right? So property was, we are declaring what value we want to change, right? Finally, we had value, right? Value was what? How do we want to change this property, right? Like, how do I want to make the font size large or small or something, right? So this is basically the syntax that we looked at, right? And then we basically played around with some code. We basically gave the h1, some color. We looked at the font size, and I told you that we'll discuss about units, right? So there are basically units in CSS. There are like pixels, rem, m, percentage as well. These are all units, and I have a separate slide for that, and I'll explain that a little later on, right? Now, the next thing we looked at after syntax was CSS selectors, right? So CSS selector was basically, we were looking at how we can, select the elements from the HTML, right? So if I go back, if you notice, you can see, right, element selector, right? So basically selector was what? The first part, the which part, right? Remember? And then we basically looked at some of the ways we can select our HTML elements. So we looked at, element selector, which was basically what? Selecting the element itself, right? So if you have an anchor tag, simply just type A, because the A is what? It is specifying the anchor tag. Like, remember I said that Visual Studio Code. So this IDE, it helps you out because it can basically it highlights the element red, right? So it basically tells you that this is an element in HTML, which you have selected and you have applied this color red, right? So this was element selecting. Like you could have selected any element, right? I could have selected this H1, this paragraph, anything, right? When I select the element, I apply the style. That is the process of doing element selecting, right? Next thing we looked at was class selecting, right? So if I go back, remember the concept of classes and IDs. Classes, I said, was what? The name, right? The name of this particular heading is heading 1, right? And the ID is like the roll number of this particular element, which is H1, right? So I said that you can basically also select, using the class as well, right? So how do you do class selecting? You basically place a dot, and after dot comes what? The class name. So remember, a class name is what? Heading 1. So remember, dot class name, apply the style. That is your class selecting, right? And we also looked at why we wanted class selecting. We said that what I wanted was, I wanted this color to be different than this color, right? I remember I said that, and we said that how we can do that, because we can't do that by simply doing element selecting, because what element selecting will do is it will apply this particular color to both the elements, right? To both these elements, it will apply the same color if I do element selecting. However, I wanted that this color to be different than this color. So that is when you'll use class selecting, right? The next thing we looked at was what? ID selecting. ID selecting was what? ID selecting was basically whenever you have an ID, right? I have an ID, similar concept to class selecting, right? I basically place a hash rather than a dot, right? And then you do ID selecting, right? Basically the application of ID selecting is rarely used as compared to class selecting, because normally people just define either class or they will define either ID. You don't have to define both of them. The only reason I've done that is basically to show you the different ways of selecting, right? So this is ID selecting and this is class selecting, right? And next thing we looked at was grouping selecting, right? Grouping selecting. So what I said was, remember I wrote something like I wanted my heading, my paragraph, and my anchor tag to all have the same color, right? Like I wanted my heading, my paragraph, and my anchor tag to all have the same color, which was yellow. So now I don't want to constantly, do something like this. I don't want to do this, like color yellow. Then I'm going to do define paragraph, color yellow, right? It's kind of a lengthy process, right? So what I did was I basically grouped the elements in which I wanted to apply the same style, right? I wanted to apply the same style, right? Remember, you cannot do grouping selecting if you want to apply different styles on these elements. Say you wanted to apply red color on this H1, but you wanted to apply yellow color on paragraph, then you can't do grouping selecting because it won't be possible, right? You can't do like yellow and red, right? That's not possible, right? So that's important to understand that you can't do grouping selecting if you want to apply different styles. And finally, we looked at universal selecting, right? Universal selecting was what? I wanted to apply this style on all the elements in my HTML, right? So I wanted to apply this particular style. So I wanted to, like, let's say I want to apply this particular font size to all the elements, right? So you can see how big it gets, right? You can see because I've applied this particular font size to all the elements. So this is what's considered a universal selector, right? So this is what we discussed in yesterday's class. So if you have any doubt regarding yesterday's class, you can ask. So yeah, I hope you have no doubt regarding yesterday's class. So today what we will start off is actually something really important, and it's referred to as the CSS box model, right? Now I'll tell you why this is really important, because in CSS you will have to basically deal with two properties which are really important to understand. And I don't know if you've heard of them, and if you haven't, it's no problem, but these properties are referred to as margin and padding. So in order to understand margin and padding, you have to understand the box model, right? So I'm gonna go here and I'm gonna explain the box model, right? So third CSS session, right? So remember, I can just declare file, CSS file. I said that you can name any, your CSS file can be named anything you want, but the standard practice is to name it style, right? Style.css. And you know how you link, I said that you basically type link colon, and you can see that the Visual Studio Code automatically suggests this option, and you can see it, now our CSS and our HTML are successfully linked, right? Now I'm going to open this with live server. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to explain this particular box model using some divisions, right? Remember divisions, I said that divisions were what? They were basically like boxes, right? They were like bags in which you wanted to kind of encapsulate data. Like you wanted like similar pieces of information within this particular box, right? That's what I said was the division tag, right? So now I'm going to declare a div, right? I'm going to say a div, and I'm going to give it a class name, right? So I'm going to say something like first div, something like this. Now within this, I'm basically going to start putting some content. So I'm going to say like heading, right? Heading like first division, right? Then I'll give a paragraph like lorem 10, right? And finally, we'll declare an anchor tag, right? Like go to Google, right? And we'll say https www.google.com, right? So anchor tag, remember a question came, what was the anchor tag in yesterday's session? Anchor tag was what? It's basically like whenever you click on like that particular link, you will be redirected to whatever is provided here, right? So if I click on this anchor tag, I will hopefully be provided, redirected to google.com. So that was the use of anchor tags. Now I'm going to go back and you can see, right, this is all that comes on our web page, right? So I also showed you like yesterday, like if I click, left click on my web page, so if I left click anywhere and I click inspect, you basically get the developers tools, in which I said that this is like your close friend when you're developing websites, right? Now you can't actually see the division, right? Like you're gonna ask, like I just said, like division is like a box, right? But if you notice, you can't really see the box. All you can see is the content, right? You can see the paragraph, you can see the heading, and you can see the anchor tag, but you can't really see the box, right? And if I hover over this, you will see the box, right? Do you notice the blue highlighted part, right? The blue highlighted part is basically that box. Right. The reason you can't see it is because we haven't really provided any background color. By default, any division has a background color of white or transparent, I think. Right. So that's why you can't see the box, right? So the box is, you can see the blue highlighted part, right? And I said that division is what? A block element, right? Like it's taking more space than it's needed, right? Now, I'm going to go in my CSS, right? And I'm going to use class selecting, right? Use class selecting to select my division, right? So how do we do that? We basically do dot and then our class name. Our class name is what? First div, right? So dot first div, right? Now here we will start writing our CSS. So I want to give it a background color of red, right? Let's see if that happens. You can see right now, you can see the division is visible. Now you can see that it's a box, right? So again, all I did was I used my class selecting, right? I could have also done this, right? I could have also done div, use element selecting. I could have done that. You can see that there's no change, right? The reason I'm doing class selecting is because I'm also in, maybe in the, the later, I may also have to define another division with a different background color. It may be that I already said that when you're developing websites, you're going to have several divisions, right? You're going to have multiple divisions. So if I start doing element selecting and I apply the same background color, and that's something you don't want, then that would be a problem, right? So this is why it's a good practice to start kind of naming your divisions, right, using class. So we have basically declared that, okay, this has a background of red color, which is a division, right? Now I'm basically, I just want you guys to, think of a box, right? Just think of any box that's lying in your, house, in your living room. Now, within that box, you have some items, right? Now, let's say within that box, because that box it's small, right? So let's consider a small box. Just think of a small box. Now, when I say small box, what do you think? Like, what do you imagine, right? So when I say small, I basically mean that the box inner spacing, like the space within that box, is limited, right? So I'm saying that a box which is considered small will have very limited space inside that box, right? And that is basically the concept of padding, right? Padding is basically saying that how much space do you want to provide within that box, right? So you can consider the ye box hai, right? Ye box hai. How much space do you want to give within this box is going to be defined by padding. And padding is basically a CSS property, right? So I'm gonna basically, so again, all the property is basically self-explanatory. All you have to do is type padding, right? Padding. Now, remember I said that padding is what you basically want to define internal space, right? Like you want to basically make this box bigger. Inside space, you want to make it a little bigger. Now I'm going to define some value. Now, don't focus on what this is. I'll explain what pixels are. Like, okay, what pixels are basically is like, if you have noticed, like in Word, what do we have? Like for font size, we have like 12 pt, 36 pt, like 48 pt. If you have gone to Word, you may have noticed, like if you want to declare the font size, right? So you can do it using pt. Similarly, pt can be equivalent to pixel. Just think of it as like that, right? So you know that something like 90 pixels would be very large, right? Something like 10 pixels would be very small. So that's basically the concept of pixels, right? Pixels are like one of the most used units in CSS, right? I'll talk more about units in the upcoming class, but for now I'm basically going to say 50 pixels. So what this is saying is, this is saying that give me, so this box, right, this particular box, it is saying give me space of 50 pixels. Give me inside space of 50 pixels, right? This is what it's saying. So if I go back, watch what happens to the box. So you can see that the box kind of, you can see the inside space. If you have noticed, like I'm just gonna disable, I'm just gonna delete it and see the effect again. You can see that inside space was very limited when I applied no padding. But when I applied padding, 50 pixels, you can see there was so much space being added, right? You can see that there was 50 pixels being added from all the sides. So another thing to consider is when we define 50 pixels, right? In what direction are you defining, right? So I said 50 pixels, but I haven't declared any direction, right? I said I wanted the box to be bigger, but in which direction? Do I want the box from the top to be bigger, from the left side, from the right side? From where do I want the box to get bigger, right? So when I say 50 pixels, padding is equal to 50 pixels, this is what basically what this is saying is I want 50 pixels from the top, I want 50 pixels from the bottom, I want 50 pixels from the left, and I want 50 pixels from the right. That's what it's saying. So when you're saying padding is equal to 50 pixels, you're saying that I want padding 50 pixels from all the sides, right? So I hope that is clear. If you didn't understand, you can ask any question. Now, yeah, you can see that we have given 50 pixels from all sides. Let me show you a better look, right? If you see, right, I'm just gonna do one thing. Just gonna, yeah. So I just basically remove the background color so you can see the padding in the developer's console, right? So watch, you can see the blue highlighted part, right? You can see this particular part, the blue highlighted part, and you can also see the purple part. That purple part is padding. That purple part refers to the padding, right? That purple part, if you see, it is basically equivalent from all the sides. You can see from the top, it's equivalent as compared to the bottom, as compared to the left, and as compared to the right, right? So that's what we're talking about padding, because our inner space just got bigger, and that is what padding refers to, right? Now, one thing you may want to I'm just gonna enable this again. Like one thing you may want to do is you may not want 50 pixels from all sides. You may want padding from only, the top, and then you may want from the left, like you want padding like 70 pixels from the top and then 60 pixels from the left, right? And some other value from the bottom. So you can also do that, right? So you can do padding, right, top, right? And then you can say like 60 pixels, right? So I'm just gonna disable this for now. I want padding from the top. I want 60 pixels, right? So it's saying that from the top, I want 60 pixels of space, right? So, and then from the left, I want like, let's say 40 pixels. And from the bottom, I want only 20 pixels. And from the right, I want 10 pixels, right? So you can see like the different effects. Like you can see there's way more space from the top as compared to the bottom, right? You can see that. And another thing that you may be noticing is that padding right, like padding right will have no effect. It will have no effect. Like if let's say I make it like 80 pixels, you can see that nothing changed within that, right? Like if I make it even 60 pixels, you can see nothing is being changed. The reason that is because all of our text is left aligned, right? So I'm going to show you when padding right will basically take into effect. So I'm going to do text align. This is another property that you can use, text align, right? So text align says where within your particular division, where do you want the text to be aligned? Do you want it left? Do you want it center? Or do you want it to the right, right? So watch, I've aligned my text to the right, right? You can see now there's some padding, right? Now there's some padding right? If I say like 100 pixels, you can see that it increased, right? So that is why now you can see that padding left has no effect. So when your text is aligned to the right, padding left will have no effect. When your text is aligned to the left, padding right will have no effect, right? So I'm just gonna disable this. Right now you can see padding right will have no effect. And these are the ways you can declare the different padding properties, right? Padding top, left, bottom, right. Right, but if you don't want to do padding top is equal to 50 pixels, and you want padding bottom 50 pixels, padding bottom, padding right, padding left 50 pixels, you can basically uh, rather than writing 4 lines of code, you can just simply write it in 1 line of code like we did here, right? So this was kind of like the concept of padding, right? And yeah, let me show you another neat technique, right? So another thing that people want is like, normally they want the same, so they want the same amount of padding from top and bottom, right? So they want same amount of padding from top and bottom, and same amount of padding for left and right, right? So like, let's say they want padding 50 pixels for the top and bottom, and they want padding left and right 20 pixels, right? So you can do like padding top, like you can do padding top 50 pixels, padding bottom 50 pixels, padding right like 20 pixels, and padding left 20 pixels, right? You can do that, but you can see again you're writing 4 lines of code, and this is it's basically wasting a lot of your time. So let me show you a neat technique in which you can basically write this in 1 line of code, right? So what you want to do is what I want to do is I want to achieve this, right? I want 50 pixels from the top and bottom, and I want 20 pixels for the left and right, right? So if I basically say padding, and I'm gonna say 50 pixels, right? I'm gonna give space, and I'm gonna say 20 pixels, right? Now what this is saying is basically 50 pixels is referring to top and bottom, right? This syntax is basically saying top, bottom, and space, right, left. This is what's saying. So we are saying that 50 pixels top and bottom, 20 pixels right and left. That's what it's saying. Right, so if I go back, you can see that there's 50 pixels from the top and bottom, and there's 20 pixels from the left, and we know that right will have no effect because all of it is left aligned, right? So this is like a neat technique if in case, right? Normally when you're developing something, you would want same amount of padding top and bottom, same amount of padding left and right, right? So this was like the whole concept of padding. So you can even see here, right? Like this is our box, right? You can consider this thing like this thing is a box, right? If you can see like this box which has a white background, right? This green thing is the border, right? It's the border. Like let me show you the border property as well, right? The border property is basically like you will say border, right? And it takes 3 values, right? It takes 3 values. The first value it takes is basically the border size, right? That's the first value it takes. Next value it takes is the type of border. That's the second value it takes. The third value it takes was basically the color. What color do you want your border to be, right? So this is the syntax of your border. So if I say border, I want my border size to be, let's say, like 10 pixels. And I want the type of my border to be solid, right? And next, I basically want to, say like I want to have a color of black, right? So this is basically a way of declaring colors within CSS. So let me talk a little bit about colors. In CSS, we basically have several ways of declaring colors, right? So you kind of like, you don't need to know a lot about this, but basically like there are hex values, right? Hex values, there are RGB values, RGB values. So this is like the RGB value, right? RGB stands for red, green, blue, right? And within this, you can basically specify any value, right? Like you can play around with these values and see what color you can get, right? And the last one is basically HSL values. HSL basically stands for hue, saturation, light. I think that's what it stands for. I'm not sure, but these are the type of colors you can basically declare, right? You have the standard CSS automated one where you can basically declare, red, black, white, all those. But these are the type of colors. Like if you want custom colors, then you're probably going to most likely be using like hex, RGB, and HSL values. So these are just a little bit about like, the way you can declare colors in CSS. Right, so if I go back, you can see that now we have a border. Like our division now has a border of 10 pixels. So this was basically what I wanted to show you, right? We have a border. So we have our box and we have our border, right? And I said that padding was what? The inner space. You can see that this was the inner space of this particular box, right? Now, this was all about padding and border. The next thing we have basically want to talk about is margin, right? Now, let's go back to our example of our box that was, sitting in our house, in our living room, right? Now, I said that I wanted my box to be bigger, right? I wanted to like have more space within it so I can place some items, let's say. Now, what I want is, now I want to see how much, how congested my living room is. Like that's I want to see like how many items there are within my living room, right? So you basically want, what I'm basically saying in an indirect way is I'm saying that how much space is there between that particular box and all the items in the living room. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying that how much space there is between that box that is lying in our living room, let's say, how much space is there between that box and all the other elements in that living room. That space that I'm talking about is referred to as margin, right? So let's say, let me give you another example. Let's say my box is, lying in the corner of the house, right? Let's say it's not lying, let's say in the living room, it's lying in the corner of the house. And all my other items are like on the opposite side of my living room, right? So in that case, you will consider the margin to be high because the space between them, the space between the box and the space between all the other items is very large, right? So that is what is referred to as margin. Margin is basically the external space. Padding, you can think of internal spacing. Margin is what? External space, right? So let me basically show you how margin works, right? So just like padding, we basically have a property called margin, right? Now, it basically works similar to padding, but I already said that padding is what? Internal spacing, right? And margin is external spacing. Now watch what happens, right? I'm gonna declare something like 100 pixels. Now we're gonna go back and see how the box has moved. You can see that before my box was where? It was somewhere like above, right? So watch. You can see that without applying any margin, my box is here, right? After applying some margin, you can see my box has moved here, right? It has moved because what did I say? I said that it wanted some external space, right? It basically wanted to get away from all the other elements, right? Now, when I say elements, I basically mean that within the HTML file, you can see that right now there's only one element, but I just said that it wants to get away from all the other elements. So if you think about it, right now I only have one element, right? I have the division element. So why do I keep saying that it wants to, there is some, why is this particular property of margin working, right? The reason it is working is because we are applying 100 pixels from all the sides. Like I want spacing from all the sides, and it's basically applying margin to the body as well, right? This is also an element, right? Within the body, we have several elements, right? Within the body, yes, we have one element. But if you think about it, the body itself is also an element, right? It's also an element in HTML, right? So right now within the body, yes, we have one element, but the body itself is also an element. So when we say margin, right, we are also basically, getting away, like we are adding space between this particular division and the body. Body is what? This whole thing. This entire web page is referring to the body, right? So it's saying that I want 50 pixels from the top of the body. That's what it's saying, right? And let me show you a better example of like how, it will work when we have different elements. So I'm gonna define another division, right? Remember I said at the start that you may have several divisions, right? This is where you'll have several divisions, and this is why it's important to name your divisions, right? Using class. So I'm gonna say class, second div, and I'm gonna do the same thing, let's say h2, second division. I'm gonna say paragraph lorem 10, right? Autofill my paragraph. This is my second division, right? So we're gonna go back to our style, and I'm gonna give it a background color, right? Second div, background color of yellow, something like that. You can see that it has a nice background of yellow, right? Now, let me show you like I'm gonna disable the margin property. Remember we applied the margin on what? This particular property, right? On this particular division, sorry, right? So I'm gonna disable it, right? I'm gonna disable it, and you can see that there's very limited space between these two, right? There's very limited space between them. Now I'm basically gonna add some margin. I'm gonna add some margin bottom, right? To see how it really, like you will see like how we basically give spacing between both these elements, right? So I'm gonna give 100 pixels from the bottom, right? So just watch what happens. I'll explain this property, but what happens. You can see how much space it has given, right? 100 pixels from the bottom, right? So like if I make it like 200, you can see this particular element keeps moving down and down. Like if I say 300, 400, you can see how far it has moved down, right? So this is the type of spacing we were referring to, external spacing, right? External space between this element and this element, right? So I hope that this is a little bit clear, like what margin is. So as I said, like I gave a margin of what, 100 pixels. Now this is the same concept here, right? Like if you remember that I said 50 pixels of padding, right? So this is the same concept. This basically says, give me 100 pixels of external spacing. This is what it's saying, right? So it basically is saying, give me 100 pixels of external spacing. So it says, give me 100 pixels from the top, give me 100 pixels from the right, give me 100 pixels from the bottom, and give me 100 pixels from the left. Same concept in padding, right? Padding, we said 50 pixels from the top, 50 pixels from the left, right, bottom, all that, right? And again, if you want to apply, custom margin, like if you want to apply margin, top of 200 pixels, and then you want margin like right of only 50 pixels, right? So I'm just going to disable this. So you can see that from the top I have 200 pixels, and from the right I have 50 pixels. Right, so this is basically when you want to apply custom margin, right? Yeah, so just like in the concept of padding we had, like if you wanted to, apply like same amount of padding from the top, like remember this where I talked about like if you wanted same padding from the top and you wanted same padding from the, left and right, same padding for top and bottom, you wanted same padding from left and right. Similarly in margin, you can do the same, right? Like I want same margin for right and left, and same margin for top and bottom, right? So again, similar concept. You define margin, right? So the first value is what? Top and bottom margin. The next value is what? Right and left margin, right? So you can basically say margin, I want 20 pixels from the top and bottom, and I want 10 pixels from the right and left. Right, so if I'll disable all these just so that we don't have any, confusion which property is being applied. So you can see that from the top and bottom, from the top, bottom, we have 20 pixels. On the left and right, we have 10 pixels, 10 pixels, 10 pixels, 20 pixels, 20 pixels, right? So that is basically the concept of margin, right? Like you can see here in the box model, margin is what? The external spacing of this particular box, right? External spacing. Padding is what? Internal spacing, right? So if you have any question related to padding and margin, you can ask. Yeah. If you, sorry, can you repeat the question? So, okay, so you're basically saying that if I give margin of 500 pixel, this is what you're saying, right? So you can see like if you give margin 500 pixels, this is basically saying like I'm not sure what you mean by middle space, like you mean this particular space, or this particular space. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so okay, let's see if we can use that. So I'm just gonna, if you're saying that if I can use this particular space, right? So I'm not sure if you can. So we'll basically see if that works, right? So I'm gonna again declare a heading, right? Extra space, right? And I'm gonna declare a paragraph. So normally what will happen is this should work, right? Like if within that space, this particular division should come. So let's see if that works. So you can see that it does work, right? This particular space that's given, it can be utilized by this particular division that we declared, right? So I actually didn't know this. This is a really good question because I thought that maybe it wouldn't have worked, but you can see that if all this free space that was given by this particular element can be used by other elements. So yeah, I hope I have answered the question. Yeah, like between the two boxes. Yeah, this is 500 pixels from the two box. Like if you want to, like, let's say I add between here. So you're saying like if I add it between these two, right? Like between these two, if I can use. So let's see if we can use. So you can see we can use, right? The only thing is now this particular margin will also be 500 pixels. The only thing is this will be on top of this, right? So this particular division, so this division, we said that we want 500 pixels, right? So from the bottom, it will have 500 pixels, right? From the top, it has 500 pixels. So you can utilize that space. You can't use this space because we said that this is 500 pixels, right? But after that, after this amount of space that we've given, 500 pixels, we can use the space, right? So it's basically saying that this 500 space is reserved for this particular division, right? After that, you can do whatever you want. So yeah, I hope I've answered the question. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, yeah, thank you, Aayush. So I was talking about basically the margin property, right? We were finishing off the margin property, right? Next thing now I hope the margin is all clear. So I'm just gonna, this is a bit too large. So I'm just gonna say 10 pixels, right? So it has 10 pixels from all sides. Now we're gonna talk something about CSS display property. Now, if you remember, I talked about, in the first, like I think yesterday's class as well, I talked about, two things. Like I said, right, remember like in HTML, we have two types of elements. We have either block elements or inline elements. Inline elements. And I said that block elements were the greedy elements that take, way amount of space than they need to. Like this division is a block element, right? And I said that inline elements are those elements which, they only take as much space as required, like this particular anchor tag, right? Now, I also said that inline elements, I said that you can basically convert, right? You can convert between block elements to inline elements and inline elements to block elements. You can do that in CSS. Right? If you remember, I said that I basically mentioned a property called span, which is basically like an inline element. And I also said that this particular element rarely gets used, right? right? And I said that the reason it gets rarely used is because you can simply convert your block elements to inline elements. So you don't even need to, some are by default inline elements, right? Some by default are inline elements. Like your image tag is your inline element. My anchor tag is an inline element, right? In some cases, you may want that within your website, you may want that two block elements to be on the same on the same line, right? You may want that. So how can you do it? Like how can you convert your block elements to inline elements, right? Like let's say if you like, you can see this is a heading, right? And this is a paragraph, right? So this is my heading and this is my paragraph. Now both of these are block elements. Both of these are block elements, which is why they're on different lines, right? Remember, block elements, they will occupy the entire space and they will be like line after line, right? Both of these are block elements. Now what I want is I want this paragraph, right? You can see this paragraph that I've highlighted to be on the same line on this heading, right? So how can I do that, right? Like you can't just do this, right? You can't just put it on the same line, right? That won't work. Like if I do this, something like this, that won't work. You can see nothing got changed, right? Because it's always a block element, right? Now this is where we'll look at converting between block and inline elements, right? So this is where the display property comes in. Like it's a very important property. So you can say we have a property called display in CSS that takes in 4 values, right? The first value it takes is block, right? Second is inline block, third is inline, and fourth is none. So let me show you, but let me first show you the inline value, right? So I said that, what did I say? I said that I want my heading and my paragraph to be on the same line. So how can we do that, right? So I can say my h1, so display, right? This is the property name. And now you can see there are several, suggestions by Visual Studio Code, right? Block, you can see inline, right? Inline block, right? All of these, right? Now I said that I wanted to convert to an inline element. Why do I want to convert it into an inline element? Is because I want h1 and paragraph to be on the same line. If they're inline elements, they're going to be on the same line. If they're block elements, they're going to be on a different line, right? So I want to convert it into inline element, right? And so do I want the paragraph, right? I want to convert it to an inline element, right? So if I go back, what I expect is I expect these to be on the same line. So you can see, right? You can see now the heading and this particular paragraph is on the same line, as well as this anchor tag, because remember, anchor tag by default is an inline element, right? So if you didn't understand, I'll explain it again. I'm going to comment this out, right? You can see that right now the heading and paragraph are, because they're block elements, they're on different lines. Now I said that I want this paragraph to be on the same line as this heading, right? This is what I wanted, right? So I'm just gonna, just because if you don't get confused, I'm just gonna disable this anchor tag for now, right? So that's what I want. So if I basically say h1 in my paragraph, display inline, that means both of these elements will be inline. So now both of them are going to be on the same line, right? Because now what it's saying is this division, this heading is taking only the amount of space as this particular text, right? That's what inline elements are. And also this particular element, this paragraph, is only taking as much space as required. It is not taking more space, right? Like when it was a block element. So this is how you can convert from block element to inline element, right? Now, one thing you may have noticed is that I had to repeat a lot of lines of code, right? I had to repeat this line of code and this line of code. Now, if you can recall, I basically mentioned something about grouping selecting, right? So I said that if you wanted to apply the same property, you can use grouping selecting. So h1 comma p display inline, right? And then I can simply just, comment these out, and you can see it's the same effect. Nothing got changed, right? So this is the display inline property, right? Converting any block element to inline element, right? The next one let's cover is a block element, like the block value, right? So let's say you have an inline element, right? So let's say like if I have this anchor tag, right? I have this anchor tag and I'm just gonna disable this for now, just so you can understand the block property. So right now we have the anchor tag, which is an inline element, right now. So I'm going to declare another inline element, right? I'm going to declare an anchor tag again, right? There are two anchor tags. Both of them are what? Inline elements, right? So if you will notice both of them are going to be on the same line. You can see, right? This is one inline element, which is one anchor tag, and this particular anchor tag is another inline element. Both of these are inline elements, which is why you can see that they're on the same line, right? Now, what I want is I want this particular element to be on the different line. I don't want them on the same line, right? Like I want this particular be on the next line, right? So how can I do that? So again, just like the concept of if you wanted to make it, go on the same line, we used display inline. Similarly, you can say that my anchor tag, right? I want to make it display block. Right. So once you make a display block, if I go back, what I expect is this anchor tag to be on one line, this anchor tag on to be on the next line. So you can see that this anchor tag is on one line and this particular anchor tag is on a different line. Right. So this is where we can use the concept of inline and block elements. Right. Converting between inline to block to inline. Right. So I hope inline and block, they are very much clear, right? So if you have any doubt regarding those, you may ask. Yeah, so the next one that we would look to discuss is the none property, right? The none property. Now, what I want in my website, so if I go back to my website, I'm looking at my website and I'm saying that ये particular division अच्छा नहीं लग रहा, right? This particular division, I'm not liking this. I want to get rid of it, right? But I'm saying I don't want to get rid of it forever. Like I wanted maybe in the future, I may want to keep it, right? Like I may want to keep it, but for now it's occupying too much space. It does not look attractive. So for now, I just want to get rid of it. Okay, so you'll say like, okay, I can easily get rid of it, right? What I can do is I can simply select all this, delete this, right? And if I go back, all of it is deleted. Yes, you can do that, right? But I said that I want to temporarily delete it, right? I may want it in the future, right? So if you have deleted from your HTML, then you again have to rewrite all of that code, like H1, then paragraph, all that, right? And that's a pretty, a difficult task to do, right? And no one wants to do that, right? So I'm just gonna bring it back, right? So I have this element, right? And my problem, what I want is I want this element to be gone, but temporary, right? I don't want it to be gone forever, right? So how can we do that? So you can basically go to that particular element, right? Remember, we have this class, which is the first div, and I want to get rid of this division, right? This particular division, I want to get rid of it temporarily. So how can I do that? I can say display, right? None, right? So what this does, this property basically says that that element should not be there, right? It should not be there, right? So if I go back, you'll see that it's basically like saying all the code from HTML has been removed. But if you notice that all my code is still there, right? All this is doing is removing that particular division, that display, right? It's saying it's displaying nothing. This is how you can think of it, right? Like it's displaying nothing. So that is basically the concept of display none, right? So none is like if you want to get rid of any element for temporary basis, you can use the concept of display none, right? The last property that we have inline block, and this is the last thing that we were covering in today's session, is inline block, right? Now, I'm just going to, I'm just going to make this because I want the element, right? I want this element. Now, if you have, like, I'm just also going to enable this property, right? I'm just going to disable this. Yeah, so remember when we converted our H1 and paragraph to inline, right? So you can see, right? This is my heading and this is my H1, right? And I'm just gonna delete these for now. Yeah, so this is my paragraph. This you can see, right? This is my paragraph and this is my heading, right? Now, to understand inline block, I'm gonna do something, right? I'm going to say like H1 background color green, right? Green. So you can see, right? The heading now has a background color of green. And I'm gonna say paragraph background color of like pink, something like that, right? So you can see that now my heading has a background color of green and it has a background color of pink. So now I want to basically show you how the inline block, like this particular property works, right? Now you may want like what you want is that you may be asking like what I want is I want the width of this, right? I want the width of this particular element to increase. So what you basically want is this green particular box should be large, right? It should be a little larger horizontally, width-wise, right? Width, right? You know the concept of like width and height, right? In terms of width, I want this element to be really large, right? So we have a property called width in CSS, right? The standard width. And we also, I basically explained the concept of pixels, right? So I want like 100 pixels on this. Let's say I want the width of H1 to be 100 pixels, right? So now normally you will expect what you'll expect. You will expect that particular heading to be a little larger, like in terms of width, right? Now, if I go back, watch what happens. So you can see that nothing actually happened. Nothing happened. Like even if I make this 1 million, like I can just keep increasing zeros. Nothing will happen. Nothing's got changed. You can see the heading is as it is. I basically added so many zeros, nothing got changed, right? Now, it is very important to understand that when your element is inline, you cannot change the width and height, right? You can't change the width and height of any inline element of this inline because we said that H1 and paragraph is an inline element, right? Because it is inline, you can't change the width and height, right? But I said that what I want is I want them to be on the same line, but I also want the width to increase. So how can we do that, right? Remember this, what my problem is, I want these two elements to be on the same line. Okay, we did that. We did that what using the concept of display inline. We converted the block elements to inline elements. We did that. There was no problem. But another problem came was I wanted this particular element to have a higher width, right? I also wanted this element to have a higher width. But now I can't do that. Why can't I do that? Because I said that it is a standard rule that inline elements cannot have, you cannot set the width and height property. You cannot change the width and height property, right? So how do we overcome this problem? So this is where we use the concept of inline block elements. If I just write inline block, right? And if I give it a pixels of like, let's say 100 pixels, right? Now remember what this is saying is, this is saying that, okay, the element is going to be inline, but you can basically start applying width and height property. So if I go back, you will see that the green box will get a little bigger. The heading will get a little bigger, right? You can see that it's not even fitting. That's why you can see that the width is basically the green box is like, it's basically gotten a little bigger. Let me show you, like you can see before it was this, right? Like it was this. I basically gave it 100 pixels, which was less, right? So it was less, not greater, by fault. It was less, right? So if I give it like a 500 pixels, you can see it's now getting bigger, right? So again, let me explain what happened. I said that I wanted inline block. Inline block is basically a property that says keep your elements. So keep your elements inline, right? Keep your elements inline, but you can now set width and height property. That's what this basically says, the inline block, right? That's what it's saying, right? So now I can set the width and width property of both of these elements, right? Like I want 600 pixels for this, right? You can see it's now getting bigger, right? You can see now it's gotten bigger, right? Like if I make it inline, you will see that So you can see that it decreased, like the width and height property are not even getting applied, right? So this is the concept of inline block elements, where you can basically make the elements inline, but you can set the custom width and height, right? So yeah, this was all about the display properties, and yeah, this is all about today's session. So if you have any questions regarding today's session, you can ask.
No questions.